Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We are putting up just a really quick poll. If you could just take a second to answer, we would really appreciate that. We're going to wait a few more minutes just so people can trickle in a bit before we begin. All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. It is right at noon. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us over your lunch hour. We are excited to be here today to discuss the science of reading for secondary instruction and specifically using morphology to help students
It's turned up as loud as it'll go.
tackle big words across content areas. I am Leah Zimmermann. I'm the Assistant Director of the Iowa Reading Research Center. I'm joined today by Dr. Heba Abdelnaby and Dr. Eleni Chatzoglou, postdoctoral research scholars at the IRRC, as well as Dr. Eunhae Cho, graduate research assistant at the IRRC. Let's go ahead and get started talking about morphology. This is our agenda for today. We'll start off by providing a brief overview of concepts and key terms that are critical to understanding morphology. We'll spend most of our time today talking about three evidence-based strategies for implementing morphology instruction with secondary students across content areas. And we'll finally end with some very exciting brand new IRC resources to support morphology instruction for secondary students. So, before discussing effective approaches to morphology instruction, let's discuss some key terms and concepts related to morphology. So, morphemes are the smallest meaningful units of language. They're like the building blocks for meaning of words. For example, in the word morphology, there are two morphemes, morph, which means form, and ology, which means science of or branch of knowledge concerning something. Together, the meanings of these morphemes create the meaning of the entire word. Morphology is a branch of knowledge related to word forms. Morphological ability is any ability that involves using morphemes to produce or understand oral or written language. Importantly, morphological ability contributes to skilled reading comprehension via both components of the simple view of reading, which is a really foundational theoretical model for how skilled reading develops. First, morphemes contribute to language comprehension by providing information about a word's meaning as well as its syntax. Uh, for, Excuse me, such as the part of speech. For example, a reader might look at the word teacher and recognize the morpheme teach, which means to show someone how to do something. They may also recognize the suffix which means someone who, and indicates a noun or it's part of speech. Finally, the reader might combine that semantic and syntactic information to determine the meaning and part of speech of the whole word. A teacher is someone who shows others how to do something, and it's a noun. So that really rich information contributes to language comprehension. Second, morphemes contribute to word recognition by providing these really large chunks of spelling and pronunciation patterns for words. These chunks are much more efficient for students to recognize than really slowly sounding out words by letter sound correspondences or even syllables in some cases. For example, if a reader sees the word eagerness in print and knows its morphemes, eager and ness, they can quickly segment or break apart the word into the morphemes and retrieve the pronunciation of each. Eagerness. Put it together, you got eagerness, right? This contributes to more efficient processing of the word eagerness than if the reader chugged the word into its letter sound mapping. So if you could imagine it trying to sound out E, G, N, S. That's a lot of work, right? That would get in the way of comprehension. Or it's even more efficient than trying to chunk eagerness into syllables. Eagerness. Those are still smaller units, which would make processing more efficient or less efficient, excuse me. So again, morphological ability is like a superpower because it contributes to skilled reading comprehension through both of those components of the simple view of reading. All right, let's go ahead and dive into a brief overview of some key morphological concepts that will support your ability to implement research-based morphology instruction. So let's talk about types of morphemes. So there are two types of morphemes overall, with free morphemes and bound morphemes. Free morphemes are those that can stand alone, such as the morphemes water and park in the word water park. On the other hand, then, bound morphemes are those that cannot stand alone as words. These include both affixes, like prefixes and suffixes, and roots. If we dive deeper, then, there are two different types of affixes, inflectional and derivational. Inflectional affixes, like the s and cats, don't change the meaning of the word, and instead change a bunch of different things, such as the verb tense or the number. Derivational affixes are different because they do change the meaning of the word. And derivational affixes include both prefixes and suffixes, unlike inflectional affixes, which are just suffixes. Let's go ahead and look at an example then of a derivational suffix. So when added to the root modern, which means relating to the present, the suffix "-ize" changes the meaning to make like something relating to the present, right? So it actually changes the meaning of the whole word itself when we add that suffix. It's important to note that the majority of morphology instruction for secondary students will focus on free and bound roots as well as derivational affixes. Other types of morphemes and other types of morphologically complex words are taught typically in earlier grades. All right, let's dive a bit further into roots to finish this up. So roots are the core units of meaning in words. They're really important because Greek and Latin roots form many vocabulary words that are critical to secondary students' academic success across content areas. So not just in ELA, but in math, science, and social studies as well. Some of the most frequently occurring Greek and Latin roots are shown here. Some examples of them are shown here on this table, such as the Latin root script, which means to write and is used in words like describe, manuscript, and inscription. We also have the Greek root micro, which means small and is used in many different words like microscope, microchip, and microorganism. Some Latin roots are free morphemes, and again, that means they can stand alone. Um, but both free and bound Latin roots can be combined with other morphemes to form words, like in the word description, in which the free morpheme script is combined with two bound affixes. Greek roots, on the other hand, are typically bound morphemes that are often combined with other morphemes using a connecting vowel. For example, if you take a look at the word thermometer, the bound root therm, which means heat, is combined with the free root meter using a connecting vowel O to create the meaning of the whole word, a measure of heat. So why is all of this important? Knowing these Greek and Latin roots unlocks many words that are critical to reading comprehension and content learning across subjects. For the remainder of this presentation today, we will discuss 3 strategies you can implement to support your students' morphological ability and relatedly, their reading comprehension and content area learning. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Chatzoglou, who will be talking about our first strategy, explicit instruction of high utility morphemes.
Great. Thank you, Leah. So at this part of the presentation, we will focus on explicit instruction of how we utility morphemes, how to teach morphemes in a clear, structured, and effective way so students can apply what they learn. explicit instruction provides students with clear and systematic practice in reading and spelling words that contain the taught morpheme while reinforcing the connection between spelling, pronunciation, and meaning. And what makes instruction explicit? It is the systematic and direct way, meaning that we don't leave learning to chance. We clearly model, guide, and support students step by step during the learning process. It is also engaging and success-oriented, so students are actively involved and experience success as they learn. In addition, explicit instruction includes frequent feedback, where teachers immediately reinforce or correct understanding, and cumulative practice, meaning students revisit and apply morphemes over the time again and again. Now, before reviewing the specific steps that we can follow to teach with explicit morphology instruction, it is important to decide which morphemes we need to teach. And here the answer is high utility morphemes. High utility morphemes are word parts that are frequent, transferable, and support comprehension of academic tasks, meaning students will encounter them often across subjects like science, social, and English studies. So, for example, roots like struct, port, and graph appear in many words and give students access to large word families. When selecting morphemes to teach, we prioritize those that appear across multiple content areas and texts. You can use resources like Morpheme Frequency List or tools such as our Word Dissector, which you will find in our Morpheme Lab that we will release next week. And Leah is going to talk about that app later today. So these tools can help you identify words that contain these morphemes, and it is important to follow a progression of difficulty. So beginning with more frequent morphemes before moving on to less frequent roots and more opaque suffixes. Now that we know how to select and find the morphemes that we need to teach, let's review the instructional steps that we need to follow. In step 1, we set the goal. We should explicitly state the morpheme, its meaning, and why it matters. For example, if I'm teaching the word struct, I'll say, today we will learn the root struct, which means to build, and you will use it to understand words across subjects like science, social, and English studies. And this helps students focus their attention and understand what they're learning and why it is useful. In step 2, review, we briefly revisit previously taught morphemes to activate prior knowledge. So, for example, I can say, yesterday we learned the root port, which means to carry. Say it with me. And then we will review a list of some words that contain the morpheme port. And we want to keep this review short, interactive, and engaging using strategies like cohort responses, so students can build connection across morphemes and support cumulative learning over the time. In step 3, we clearly present the morpheme using a student-friendly definition that it is short, clear, and easy to remember. For example, the root struct means to build. And this is something that students can easily understand and they can apply across words. Avoid definitions that they are too vague, broad, or too technical. For example, if you say struct means make, this is somehow unclear and it may confuse students. The definition should focus on accurate meaning using everyday vocabulary. And we want for students to have a lot of opportunities to see, say, and write the morpheme. So, for example, they may see the root struct on the class whiteboard, they will read struct aloud all together, spell it, and write it while saying each letter. This helps students build a strong connected understanding of the morpheme. In step 4, modeling, we explicitly show how the morpheme works by using examples. Examples help students see how the morpheme contributes to meaning across different words and contexts. So, for example, for the root struct, words like construct, instructor, structure, and distraction all connect to the idea of building or putting together. Examples should be carefully selected to clearly show the morpheme's meaning. They should be words that appear across contexts and combine with different affixes. In the next step, students begin applying the morpheme with teacher support through a clear instructional progression from word level to sentence and text practice. This helps students move from accuracy at the word level to meaningful use in context. So at the word level, students focus on routines like see it, break it, read it, and spell it, while they identify the morpheme, read it, spell it, and connect meaning. And this builds the reading, spelling, and vocabulary of the students. At the sentence and text level, students apply the morpheme in context by underlying, identify the morpheme, explaining it, and generating their own sentences or responses, which supports comprehension and transfer across content areas. So throughout guided practice, it is important teachers to provide students with multiple opportunities for practice, as well as immediate and specific feedback to reinforce correct understanding and address any misconceptions. Here we have an example of a graphic organizer that you can use to teach morphology with explicit instruction and practice with your students at word level. I will model how you can use this with your students. Let's say this is Maria's worksheet. I'll start by saying, look at the word instructor. Work with your partner to circle for today morpheme struct. Are you all done? Great. Let's move to step 2. Work with your partner to circle all the morphemes that you see in the word instructor. Good job, everyone. The morphemes we see here are in, struct, or. Now read the word aloud to your partner. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go! Instructor. Awesome. Now I want each of you to write the word instructor for step 4. And then we have students write the word instructor next to step 4. Nice job. Let's move to step 5. Then talk to your partner about the morphemes in this word and what they mean. Then write each morpheme and its meaning in the table. You have 5 minutes. And then once students complete this step, we move to last step. All right, time is up. Last step, work with your partner to write a definition for the word instructor using the meanings of each morpheme. And that's one way that we can use this graphic organizer. You can find it on our Morpheme Lab next week. Feel free to use it or adapt it to the needs of your students. In last step, independent practice, students apply the morpheme on their own as teacher support is gradually reduced. So this step is critical because it shows if students have truly learned to recognize, spell, and use the morpheme independently in context. At this stage, students should engage in tasks that require them to apply the morpheme across words, sentences, and short text, activities similar to those in guided practice. It is important here in guided and independent practice that we don't introduce new tasks. We want students to do what we exactly model for them. Also, students work independently. They still continue to receive affirmative and corrected feedback at this step as the scaffolding is reduced until the master level. This step ensures students move beyond guided support toward mastery and transfer, meaning that they can apply their morphology knowledge when reading and writing across content areas. And with these steps, we complete the explicit morphology instruction. Let's move now on how they can further apply their understanding of these morphemes. And I will hand it to my colleague, Dr. Abdelnaby. Heba?
Thanks, Eleni. Now we'll talk about a second strategy for morphology for secondary learners, and this strategy is morphemic analysis strategy. So what is morphemic analysis strategy? Morphemic analysis strategy helps students to break a word into roots, prefixes, and suffixes. This strategy helps the students identify what each part means, then combine the meanings to figure out the whole word. Finally, students test the new word in a sentence and check if the meaning makes sense. Before teaching the morphemic analysis strategy, as a teacher, I will select or prepare a short text with several target words. I will choose 2 to 3 high utility words, which my colleague Eleni just talked about, that words that occur across different subjects. And then I will choose those words from those words what fits with the lesson and make good examples for breaking down morphemes. I will check the words morphemes using the soon-to-be-released Word Dissector app. I will make copies of the morphemic analysis graphic organizer, which will be also available next week on the Morpheme Lab resources, and those are shown on the screen. Teaching morphemes effectively follows a clear sequence of explicit instruction steps that support the students in breaking down new word parts and figuring out their meanings. Similar to explicit instruction, I will first introduce the goals and review previously taught morphemes. And in my case, I will ask my students to review the root struct, which was taught previously in my colleague's Eleni's example. I will ask students to turn and talk. Then I will introduce the morphemic analysis strategy, explaining the steps and when students will use it. For example, I will say, our new strategy is called morphemic analysis, which helps you figure out unknown words while reading. First, find the root, then identify familiar prefixes and suffixes and combine their meaning. Today, we will use this strategy to understand complex words in a science passage about cells. Then we'll move to step number 4, which is modeling. In step number 4, I will model the strategy by thinking aloud as I break a word into its morphemes and fill out the graphic organizer. In this step, I will model the morphemic analysis strategy using a think aloud, clearly explaining each decision while analyzing the word. I will complete the morphemic analysis graphic organizer to determine how the strategy is applied. So, for example, here we have the science text. It's about how cells are built and how they move and what matters. And the target word here is transportation. So in this step, I will model morphemic analysis for breaking down the target word transportation. I will explain the meaning of each morpheme. So as a teacher, I would say, the word transportation, this is the new word. I don't know the meaning of this word. Now let's look first at the root. What's the root of the word transportation? The root is port. What does it mean? It means to carry. I will write port and to carry in step number 1, the root in my morphemic analysis organizer. Then we'll move to the next step, which is identifying the prefixes. What's the prefix in this word, transportation? Or the prefix which comes before the root, H is a trans. A trans. What does a trans mean? A trans means across. I will write the prefix trans and the meaning across. Then next comes the suffix. I will find the suffix. What's the suffix in this word? Comes after the root. It's Asian. What does Asian mean? It means act or state of, and I will fill out this part of the graphic organizer. I will continue following the same step, doing it with the rest of the word. So I will now test the whole word meaning. Now, putting the three parts together, the prefix meaning, the root, and the suffix, what does the word would be? It would be the act of carrying across. Then I will ask myself, I will check and see if it makes sense in step number 4 by saying, like, I ask myself, does this make sense? I think it does. In the sentence before the one that uses the word transportation, it says the cytoplasm is filled with cellular fluid, nutrients, and proteins, which it moves through the cell. When transportation is used in the next sentence, then it refers to this movement or carrying of cellular fluid, nutrients, and proteins across the cell. Therefore, my definition makes sense. I will write yes in my graphic organizer to indicate that I checked my meaning in the sentence from the text and it makes sense. During this step, also, I can include an example where I intentionally combine the parts incorrectly at first and then show my students how to use the final step to check and fix the definition. In step number 5, students will practice the strategy in pairs or smaller groups by analyzing 2 to 3 new words. I would support my students by guiding each step through prompting, such as telling them the next step. For example, I would say, look at the beginning of the word to find the prefix, write it down, and determine its meaning. Or asking them to recall it. For example, what part of the word comes first? Can you find the prefix and tell me what does it mean? And just reminding them to use the strategy without giving them answer. And I would say, remember to check the suffix in the morphemic analysis graphic organizer and see how it contributes to the meaning of the word. It is helpful when teaching morphemic analysis to begin with words containing a prefix, root, and derivational suffix. As we see here in the table, first start with like a word like a transportation. It has the 3 components. It has the prefix, root, and suffix. And then we started gradually introducing words with varied morphemic structures, like roots with inflectional suffixes, as in moving, controls, brighter, or other words like root, prefix and root, or roots with multiple words with multiple roots, as in Latin and like as in technical terms or scientific terms, as in cytoplasm, chloroplast, and such. We'll move to the last step of the strategy, independent practice. In step number 6, students moves to independent practice. As students show they can use the strategy accurately, I, as a teacher, gradually step back and let them apply it to new words in the text. The final step in today's lesson is to practice applying the morphemic analysis strategy on your own. Please use the last 10 minutes of the class to complete the graphic organizer for the word exporter and obstructive. I will be coming around to answer any questions and provide feedback. And as my colleague Eleni mentioned earlier, like during this stage, we just make sure that students are applying the things that they learned. We're not introducing new tasks. And the scaffolding would be reduced, and teacher role would be supporting students and making sure and answering any questions. Now I will hand the presentation to Dr. Eunhae Cho to talk about the word building strategy, a form of generative morphology instruction.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelnaby. I will now introduce the third strategy, word building strategy. Generative morphology instruction is a practical way to help students expand vocabulary efficiently, especially in secondary content area reading and writing. While morphemic analysis helps students decode words and infer meaning, generative morphology helps them produce and choose precise academic words in speaking and writing. A key idea here is that students learn both the productive patterns for building words and the constraints that limit certain combinations. They learn to reason with word formation rules rather than simply mixing and matching parts freely. Ultimately, this helps them understand which combinations are actually acceptable, conventional, and meaningful. The word-building strategy teaches students to combine morphemes to create new words and meanings, drawing their understandings of how word parts contribute to meaning and grammatical function. In this strategy, students follow through 3 steps. First, in the build word steps, students physically move morpheme cards to test combinations. These tactile steps helps them visualize how affixes change a base word's meaning, its part of speech, or sometimes both. Second, in the record and reflect step, students use a word-building graphic organizer to record the word's parts from the cards they just manipulated. They then explain how each part contributes to the word's overall meaning and grammatical function. Finally, in the apply in context step, students use their newly generated word to write sentences connected to their content area learning on the graphic organizer and check to ensure the word makes sense in context. Now, let's look at what these 3 steps look like in the practice during explicit instruction. To prepare, our first step is to select the target morphemes. We want to choose about 5 high-utility morphemes that unlock large word families so students can generalize them to multiple academic contexts. For example, if I were to model this strategy today, I would select the CAP family. I know my students will encounter words like capacity, capture in geography, but also words like concept, exception, or intercept across many other subjects. Next, we prepare our materials. For the first step we discussed, which is build words, we use morpheme cards to make morphological relationship visible. Then for the record and apply steps, we use word-building graphic organizer that students can reuse across lessons. As you can see, the organizer consists of 2 parts. Part 1, complete the chart, is where students do the record and reflect step. And part 2, sentence application, is for the apply in context step. Once our materials are ready, we move to step 1, set the goal, and step 2, review. Similar to the previous 2 strategies, we begin the lesson by setting a clear goal, such as introducing the CAP family to build science vocabulary for an ecosystem unit. Then we briefly review familiar affixes like X or able to activate prior knowledge. Since we've already seen how these first 2 steps work in practice, let's jump right into the core strategy of this strategy, which is step 3 modeling. In step 3 modeling, we demonstrate how to build a word using the morpheme cards and how to record that process on the word-building graphic organizer. First, we move the morpheme cards together to visually show students how the word parts combine. For example, using the morpheme cards cap, meaning to hold, and ed, meaning the state of, we would build a word meaning the state of what something can hold. We would also explain to the students that since cap pd doesn't sound quite right, we add the connector ä to help with the pronunciation. We make sure to emphasize that ä is not a morpheme and does not add any meaning to the word. Next, we fill out the column in part 1. The 2 morphemes go under the morphemes column, and the final word, capacity, goes under the word sum. And the combined meanings, which is the state of what something can hold, goes under literal meaning. Lastly, we identify the word as a noun because the suffix ed makes the word into a noun. Next, in part 2, on the right side, we apply the newly built word capacity in a context sentence. We would write something like, the capacity of this ecosystem is limited by its water supply. Once the sentence is written, we teach them 3 simple checks to self-evaluate the sentence. 3 checks are 1, recheck the morpheme meanings, 2, verify the parts of speech, and 3, confirm the word meaning in context. These directly correspond to the columns word correct, parts of speech correct, and meaning fits in part 2. To show how students how this works, we model the process by thinking aloud. We would think aloud and say something like, I'm going to apply these three checks to make sure the sentence I just wrote works. First, for a word correct, I'll ask, did I spell the word to match the morphemes I built? Yes, it matches, so I'll put a check mark here. Second, I'll check the parts of speech. After the word the sentence needs a noun. Since capity is a noun, which we know because of the suffix ity, it fits perfectly. So I'll put a check mark here. Lastly, for meaning fits, does capacity mean how much the ecosystem can hold in this context? Yes. So the water supply limits how much life the ecosystem can support. The sentence makes sense in the geography context, so I'll put the final check mark here. So this kind of explicit modeling prepares students to use these exact same checks to self-correct when they start building words on their own. As a quick teacher tip, we also highly recommend modeling non-examples during this step, showing a common mistakes and using these three checks to catch. It is a powerful way to teach students how to self-correct. This kind of explicit modeling prepares students to confidently build and revise words on their own during a later independent practice phase. We now move to step 4, guided practice. Here, students follow the exact same process using their morpheme cards and the graphic organizer, but this time with teacher support. To gradually release responsibility to the students, we guide them using 3 specific prompts, which is tell, ask, and remind. For example, if a pair of students is struggling, we wouldn't just give them the answer. We might ask, what part of speech does this suffix typically form? To prompt them to revisit the strategy. During this phase, we intentionally choose words that show a range of morphological patterns. For instance, continuing with the cat family, you would have students explore root variations by building words like concept, exception, intercept, receive, or recipient. As students build these words and use a sentence checklist, we monitor their progress and provide brief, immediate corrective or affirmative feedback. Finally, we reach step 5, independent practice. This is where students apply the word-building strategy entirely on their own or with a partner. They start by completing part 1, recording the morphemes they combined, the resulting word, its literal meanings, and its parts of speech. Next, they move to part 2 to apply the word in a sentence. Just like we modeled earlier, students use the sentence checklist to reflect on whether their chosen word, part of speech, and meanings make sense in that content area context. To wrap up the lesson, we revisit the initial goal, have students summarize the strategy, and preview how this word building works will connect to their future content area learning. I will now hand it back to Dr. Zimmermann, who will show the demonstration of the Morpheme Lab that my colleagues have been referring to.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cho. So I am very excited to talk about several new morphology resources that the Iowa Reading Research Center is going to be releasing in the next week. So the first resource that I'm going to talk about is called our Morpheme Lab. And so this is a brand new collection of research-based resources to support morphology instruction that you'll be able to find on our website. So first, we are going to be releasing a new e-learning module called Effective Morphology Instruction for Secondary Students Across Content Areas. And in this e-learning module, we'll expand quite a bit on some of the topics that we just covered in this presentation, from key concepts and terms related to understanding morphology and how it contributes to reading development, and then to the 3 strategies that my colleagues just explained and demonstrated. So explicit instruction of high utility morphemes, morphemic analysis, and word building. These e-learning modules are highly interactive. They can contain exemplar videos from secondary classrooms demonstrating the strategies with students. There are also interactive checks for understanding to build your own knowledge of research-based morphology instruction and related concepts. Second on the Morpheme Lab are free downloadable graphic organizers that can be used to plan and implement morphology instruction in your classrooms. So these include the 3 graphic organizers that were presented with those 3 strategies today. So for morphemic analysis, morpheme practice with the see it, break it, read it, write it routine, as well as the word building 2-part graphic organizer. We also have a really wonderful set of morpheme cards that will be included in the Morpheme Lab. So we have over 200 printable morpheme cards that can be used to support your implementation of the word building strategy. You can see an example here on the screen. So we have high utility roots and affixes that research has shown are used frequently across secondary content areas from ELA to math to science to social studies. And then finally, in the Morpheme Lab, we will also have our brand new word dissector application, which I will talk about now. So Word Dissector is a free online morphology tool that can be used by educators as well as their students. And there are 3 functions that can be completed with the Word Dissector tool. First, teachers and students can use this tool to enter a morphologically complex word, so a word that contains 2 or more morphemes. And this tool will identify the morphemes that make up that word, as well as the meanings of those morphemes. So when you're going to plan instruction and you want to be able to model words and how to break them down, for example, in the morphemic analysis strategy, this tool can ensure that you have an accurate breakdown of those morphologically complex words. On the flip side, students can also do that when they encounter a word they don't know and they're trying to determine which morphemes make up the word. Students can go to this tool and use it in the same way. The second function of the tool is to identify words that contain a target morpheme. So this can be especially useful when implementing explicit instruction of high utility morphemes. So as Dr. Chatzoglou talked about previously, when we explicitly teach high utility morphemes, we want to identify multiple examples of words that contain that morpheme. And this tool can be used to do that. So teachers can enter a morpheme and you'll get a list of words that contain that morpheme. And then finally, the third function is to provide some practice matching morphemes to their meanings. So students can use this to take a look at a word and see if they can match a list of meanings to the morphemes that are in the word. Teachers can use it too if you also want a little bit of practice building your own morphological knowledge. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look. Now I'm going to demonstrate those 3 functions of the Word Dissector tool. So again, the first function is to identify the morphemes and meanings and their constituent meanings in a word. So let's say that I'm a teacher and I am going to be modeling the morphemic analysis strategy with the word autobiography. So I would go to the Word Dissector tool here. You can see the home page. I would type in the word autobiography. You can see it is in our database. And I can see that this word is made up of 4 morphemes. And I can click on each of those morphemes to get more information about this word. So I get the morphemes that are in the word, their meanings, the language of origin for each of the morphemes, as well as its type. So whether it's a root, and then if it is an affix, what type of affix it is. All right. Then I mentioned before that you can also within this tool get some practice, right? Matching morphemes to their meanings to build morphological knowledge. This could be for students or teachers. So for our autobiography example, if I wanted to complete a little bit of practice matching those morphemes to meanings, then I could go ahead and click meaning match on the word dissector tool. And you'll see then that the words or the morphemes are displayed as well as the meanings of each morphemes. And I can get some practice going through and clicking on them to match each morpheme with its meaning. I can get feedback if my responses are correct or incorrect. I can try again if they are incorrect. So again, just a little bit of practice that's engaging to build that morphological knowledge. And then finally, that third function of the word dissector tool is to help you plan for instruction to identify words that contain a target morpheme. So let's say I was going to plan and implement explicit instruction of the high utility morpheme bio. I could, on that page, click search for morphemes. I would type in bio. I would then be taken to a list of all of the words in our database that contain that high utility morpheme um, that I could then use for my explicit instruction of that target morpheme bio. Let's say I selected the word biotechnology or I was thinking about it, then I could click on it and go through that same process. I could see the roots or the morphemes that comprise that word, their meanings, languages of origin, and morpheme types as well. So we are really excited to be releasing this tool next week. We think it's going to be really beneficial for teachers to plan and implement evidence-based morphology instruction, as well as for students in their exploration as well. I will note, you can see we have over 4,000 morphologically complex words that are included in our database. These are taken from research that shows that they're used frequently across academic content areas for secondary students. So be sure to check it out when that resource, as well as the Morpheme Lab, is released next week. All right, so that brings us to the end of our presentation for today. And just taking a look at the time, we do have some time left for questions. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them into the chat. Let's see, it looks like we do have some questions that have come in. Let's go ahead and take a look. I think this one is for Dr. Cho, if you wouldn't mind taking this. This is about the word building strategy. And it says, what should I do if students just mix and match morpheme cards and they create words that aren't real, like non-words? Or what if they do if they make a mistake, like using the wrong part of speech in a sentence?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think this is exactly why we would explicitly model the non-example and teach the three checks during the lesson. So if a student creates an incorrect combination, instead of simply giving them the correct answer, what we'll do is we'll guide them back to the checklist on the word building graphic organizer. And we'll encourage them to self-evaluate by asking the three checks like, is this a real, correctly spelled word based on the morphemes? So we'll check whether it's a word correct. And secondly, does it match the required parts of speech for the sentence? So we'll review the sentence, what is missing in that sentence. For example, the example that I was shown was the, and then there was a noun, the. So we will explicitly find the word that has a suffix that makes the word a noun. So that's how we will check this part of speech correct. And then also the meaning fits part, we'll also review whether the meaning makes sense in this context. So the key here is to help students independently recognize the constraints of this word formation rather than just giving them the solution or having them play with the morpheme cards.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a great question. And thank you, Dr. Cho, for your answer to that. All right, it looks like we have another question. And Dr. Chatzoglou, if you wouldn't mind taking this one. It says, how does this connect to vocabulary instruction I'm already doing? Does it replace it or add to it?
Mhm. Yes, that's a great question, and I think the short answer it adds to it. So I will not say that morpheme instruction is supplementary to vocabulary instruction. I will say that it is a multiplier of the vocabulary work that we're already doing. Uh, During the traditional vocabulary instruction, typically we teach a few words at a time, which is extremely valuable, but also it is somehow limited. And with morpheme instruction, we can give students a tool to figure it out words that they are not familiar to them on their own. So words that we haven't taught before. If you teach, for example, the root struct that we talked about before, and its meaning is to build, you're not teaching just one word. You are giving students access to words like construct, instructor, and many more. So with existing vocabulary instruction still matters, and you should continue doing it for teaching content-specific terms. And with morpheme instruction, you can build a broader strategy that students can apply independently. And over the time, you may find that these two approaches start to blend naturally and reinforce each other and build strong student foundational skills.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for that question. Let's see. Dr. Abdelnaby, looks like we have a question about morphemic analysis. So says, I am a science teacher, biology teacher. How can I apply the morphemic analysis strategy in content area classes like mine?
So the morphemic analysis strategy, it's not just specifically restricted to ELA or English language art. It could be applied in different contexts. So, for example, for science, when teaching science, we can like analyze the word biology. For example, bio means life, logi science, and study of like, and then especially in science, there are many terms that have Latin and Greek origins, so we can teach students the like terms like the word logi will become across different ways, scope, those morphemes that students will come across a lot. So we'll teach students how to break down the words into more morphemes and figure out their meanings, especially they are technical and they are according to the complexity of the terms, they are the highest complex words, the science technical words. We can use teachers can use the word dissector app to analyze the words in science words into morphemes, and they can apply it when for teaching science. They can use the same steps. Look at the word, identify the root, identify the prefix, the suffix, or like in science, in the case of science terms, the word would have like two roots. So teachers can apply the same steps, but just like be cautious about what's the root, the word structure, because each word has different morphology structure. And try to, as we mentioned, like start from, prefix, root, suffix, to talk about like words with two roots.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, looks like we have a lot of questions. This is great. Looks like we have a question. So with the Morpheme Lab, specifically the matching portion, will there be a way we can push out a link to kids for them to do the practice or a specific word, or is it that they have to look up the word and then do the matching? So this is a great question, and you're giving us great ideas for some further development of the lab. In this first release of our word dissector tool, the student would have to look up the word and then do the matching for specific words. There is a function, if I don't know if you noticed it on the web page, that says random, and it will actually generate a random morphologically complex word, and students could practice with that. But if you're looking for specific words that are tied to your content area curriculum, for example, then students would need to go ahead and go look those up. I think it's a really great idea. And perhaps something for us to think about for future development of ways that we could build out that student practice portion. So thank you very much for that question and for that suggestion. Let's see. We have another question that says, do you have specific lessons or morphemes that would be appropriate for each grade level? So I would say we don't have lesson plans or specific lessons that we're putting out. We are putting out materials related to those three strategies that we mentioned in the presentation. I would really suggest that teachers try to incorporate morphology instruction tied to content area texts. So, looking for identifying words that are critical to comprehension or to content area understanding, and conducting or implementing evidence-based morphology instruction with those. We do have on the Morpheme Lab, we have lists of morphemes that are considered to be the most high utility across content areas. So those would be great morphemes to teach because they'll unlock understanding and comprehension in lots of different subjects. We also have lists of morphemes that are used most frequently within particular subject areas across English language arts, science, math, and social studies. So I wouldn't say that we have the ability to separate by grade level, but we do have resources available by content area, and those that work well across all of them. So definitely check those out for sure. All right. I think that's just about all the time we have for questions, and that was the last question that had come through. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up. I just want to remind everyone that the Iowa Reading Research Center's Iowa Science of Reading Summit is coming up. It's quickly approaching June 16th to 17th. In Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Registration is open. We have a really great lineup of speakers. Our featured speaker is Dr. Mark Seidenberg from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have other great featured speakers like Dr. Jessica Tost from the University of Texas at Austin and Dr. Adria Truckenmiller from Michigan State University. It will be a great conference with lots of learning about the science of reading as well as networking with educators. So we would encourage you to take a look and we'd love to see you there. Finally, we at the Iowa Reading Research Center are always here to help. We want to support educators in their implementation of evidence-based literacy instruction and assessment for all students. If you have questions that you would like us to answer, please reach out. The QR code has a link to ways that you can contact us. So we'd love to be a partner with you as you implement the science of reading for your students. With that, we will go ahead and end our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us, most likely on your lunch hour, to talk about evidence-based morphology instruction for secondary students across content areas. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.